Welcome to the Ben Gregersen Show.
But there is no better example, again I say, than the UN weapons inspection system itself. Yes, he has tried to thwart it in every conceivable way, but the discipline, determination, year in, year out effort of these weapons inspectors is doing the job, and we seek to finish the job. Let there be no doubt, we are prepared to act. But Saddam Hussein could end this crisis tomorrow, simply by letting the weapons inspectors complete their mission. He made a solemn commitment to the international community to do that and to give up his weapons of mass destruction a long time ago now. One way or the other, we are determined to see that he makes good on his own promise. Saddam Hussein's Iraq reminds us of what we learned in the 20th century and warns us of what we must know about the 21st. In this century, we learn through harsh experience that the only answer to aggression and illegal behavior is firmness, determination, and, when necessary, action. In the next century, the community of nations may see more and more of the very kind of threat Iraq poses now. A rogue state with weapons of mass destruction, ready to use them or provide them to terrorists, drug traffickers, or organized criminals who travel the world among us unnoticed. If we fail to respond today, Saddam and all those who would follow in his footsteps will be emboldened tomorrow by the knowledge that they can act with impunity, even in the face of a clear message from the United Nations Security Council and clear evidence of a weapons of mass destruction program. But if we act as one, we can safeguard our interests and send a clear message to every would-be tyrant and terrorist that the international community does have the wisdom and the will and the way to protect peace and security in a new era. That is the future I ask you all to imagine. That is the future I ask our allies to imagine. If we look at the past and imagine that future, we will act as one together, and we still have, God willing, a chance to find a diplomatic resolution of this. And if not, God willing, the chance to do the right thing for our children and grandchildren. Thank you very much.
Iraq is a long way from Ohio, but what happens there matters a great deal here. For the risk that the leaders of a rogue state will use nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons against us or our allies is the greatest security threat we face. And it is a threat against which we must and will stand firm.
Or we take some ambiguous third route, which gives him yet more opportunities to develop this program of weapons of mass destruction and continue to press for the release of the sanctions and continue to ignore the solemn commitments that he made.
There are such a thing as international outlaws. I'm not sure China is one, but I'm quite sure Iran and Iraq are.
He will rebuild his arsenal of weapons of mass destruction. And someday, some way, I am certain he will use that arsenal again, as he has 10 times since 1983.
Saddam Hussein certainly has chemical and biological weapons. There's no question about that.
There is unmistakable evidence that Saddam Hussein is working aggressively to develop nuclear weapons. and will likely have nuclear weapons within the next 5 years. We also should remember we have always underestimated the progress that Saddam Hussein has been able to make in the development of weapons of mass destruction.
We know he continues to attempt to gain access to additional capability, including nuclear capability. There is a real debate how far off that is, whether it's a matter of years or whether it's a matter of less than that. And so there's much we don't know.
Saddam Hussein, in effect, has thumbed his nose at the world community. And I think that the President is approaching this in the right fashion.
Do you believe we could have disarmament without regime change?
I doubt it. I can support the President. I can support an action against Saddam Hussein because I think it's in the long-term interests of our national security.
Serving on the Intelligence Committee and seeing day after day, week after week, briefings on Saddam's weapons of mass destruction and his plans on using those weapons, he cannot be allowed to have nuclear weapons. It's just that simple.
Bill, I support the President's efforts to disarm Saddam Hussein. I think he was right on in his speech tonight. The lessons we learned following September the 11th were that we can't wait to be attacked again, particularly when it involves weapons of mass destruction. So, regrettably, Saddam has not done the right thing, which is to disarm, and we're left with no alternative but to take action.
When I made the decision to remove Saddam Hussein from power, Congress approved it with strong bipartisan support. While it's perfectly legitimate to criticize my decision or the conduct of the war, it is deeply irresponsible to rewrite the history of how that war began. These critics are fully aware that a bipartisan Senate investigation found no evidence of political pressure to change the intelligence community's judgments related to Iraq's weapons programs. As our troops fight a ruthless enemy determined to destroy our way of life, they deserve to know that their elected leaders who voted to send them to war continue to stand behind them.
Your calculations are on point about all the things that the United States could have spent instead of going to war in Iraq. But how come the U.S. Congress, under the leadership of the Democrats, hasn't exercised the power of the purse and pulled the funding and said, you know what, we're not going to continue in this war?
Well, we have in the House over and over again in the past year, and tried to even before we were in power, but speaking to now that we are, sent bills to the United States Senate over and over again that said that we're certainly not going to leave our troops stranded. But what we're saying is the purpose of the funding should be for the redeployment of our troops out of Iraq in a manner that is responsible, safe, and honorable, and it has to be completed within 1 year.
Washington, where the new Democratic congressional majority drew a line in the sand of sorts with the president on the topic of Iraq. With us tonight, our chief White House correspondent, David Gregory, with more on this. David, good evening.
Brian, good evening. Democrats wasted little time challenging the president over Iraq, objecting to the expected call for a surge of troops, saying that would be, quote, a serious mistake. The president will announce a new strategy for Iraq next week, but today, with the details of a troop surge already public, Democratic leaders shot it down, insisting troops should start coming home in 4 to 6 months.
If he's listening to his commanders, he can't do this.
Barack Obama, a likely 2008 contender, was among the senators who met with the president today and voiced concerns.
Sending more troops in rather than initiating some sort of phased withdrawal makes them feel as if we will be there to prop them up in perpetuity, and that's a mistake.
Administration sources say the president will order a surge of up to 20,000 troops divided between Baghdad and Sunni-dominated Anbar province. Included in the new strategy would be a boost in economic aid. As for the Democrats, they may be unable to stop any call for a troop surge, but with control of Congress now, they do intend to turn up the political heat on the White House. Brian, the first hearing on Iraq is slated for next Wednesday.
Well, that was a video, showing the Democrats and their hypocrisy. Because the Democrats call George Bush a liar for saying that there was weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, even though they said there was weapons of mass destruction in Iraq for years. The Democrats said there was WMDs in Iraq. So they're hypocrites by saying that they're hypocrites when they say that George Bush lied, because the Democrats were saying the same thing, including President Bill Clinton when he was president. All of the intelligence agencies around the world said that Iraq had WMDs. And like I said in my last show, we actually found WMDs. The idea that we went to Iraq and found no evidence of WMDs is a lie. And if you notice in that video, it even showed some of the evidence and some of the news stories about how we found WMDs. But I actually want to show you some pictures of some WMDs of soldiers finding them that were buried under the earth and elsewhere. So I got some pictures here. See, there's a picture there of some of our troops. They found a WMD missile that was buried in the earth. Saddam likely buried this ballistic missile here to hide it from the UN inspectors. There's another picture of this is actually another missile or pod that they had found that was buried. Anyways, I kind of talked about last week too about how one of Saddam's top generals had said that Saddam's WMDs were moved into Syria just prior to the war. Well, I got an article here, and it talks about David Kay. And to give you some background on who David Kay is, David Kay is somebody that our government had hired to be the head of the Iraq Survey Group, or the ISG. And that team, they went to Iraq to look for evidence of weapons of mass destruction and to study Iraq's WMD program. And this is what this article said, and this is from the Telegraph, which is a UK news organization. This is by Con Collin. And well, I guess I'll answer this real quick. Hello, welcome to the Ben Gregersen Show.
Yeah, Ben, I'm just going to say something that's kind of disturbing to me is I used to be a Democrat. I know
Oh, yeah?
Reagan, but I haven't been a Democrat for 20 years, but each time I find out that the Democrat Party is lying or covering up or creating some kind of narrative that they put on the news and they just replay the lie over and over and over again until millions of people fall for something that isn't true, the madder I get. I mean, my grandfather used to be a county commissioner. He stood up for the working man. He was a labor union leader. And honesty and integrity was always part of the party back then.
Yeah.
Now I find out that these people are covering up all of this stuff that happened in Iraq in order to use it for political purposes so they can get elected and make everybody hate the Iraq war and make everybody mad at our soldiers for what they've done over there.
Yeah, the media sure seems to be concealing the truth, doesn't it?
And here we find out that Israel would have been, millions of people in Israel would have been killed had George Bush not gone into Iraq. They were planning a raid with WMDs on Israel. They had tons of sarin gas. Now that sarin gas is so potent that one drop of it could kill 20 people.
Yeah.
a cup of it or a gallon of it could kill an entire city.
Yeah.
And they were going to drop that on Israel.
That's what Saddam's top general was saying, is that Saddam wanted to attack Israel, but he, I guess, argued with Saddam and tried to convince him not to do it.
So how could these leaders, like Harry Reid, these people that call themselves responsible Democrats, hide these kinds of issues and realize that they could have used that stuff on the United States? They could have dumped that on one of our major cities.
Well, and what's funny about that is the video we just watched, you saw Harry Reid on there saying that there was WMDs in Iraq and that Bush was doing the right thing and going in there.
Well, but then when it became politically expedient to go against Bush in order to get their own guys elected, then all of a sudden they changed the narrative. MSNBC News goes along with it, and they get everybody mad at things that aren't even true, and get people mad at people that didn't even do anything wrong except try to do what was right. And then they become destroyed politically just so these guys can keep their self-elected. It's enough to make me want to chew nails. I just can't believe it.
Well, they're hypocrites.
I'm glad you're bringing this out to the people of Pocatello.
Oh, well, thanks.
I wish it could get out clear over the country, though, because it's just maddening.
Yeah. Well, I post these videos on YouTube, so maybe, there's a way we could get them out to people on the other, around the country. People email it to their friends and that kind of thing.
Another thing they cover up is Iraq is doing pretty darn good over there. Right now, they're about 16% of their national product is higher than Iran or even higher than the United States. They are really doing gun ho, and their people, 90% of their people get out and vote.
Yeah.
The women have thrown those crazy headdresses off, and they have American hairdos now. They've got rid of Sharia law over there in Iraq. The people are smart. I mean, they're going out and voting against this stuff. They're becoming Americanized. They're becoming, civilized over there. They still have the terrorists in there blowing things up once in a while, but that's the only thing we ever hear about. We don't hear about all these positive things that are happening in Iraq.
I've actually read some stories about how the Iraqi military is actually doing a pretty good job at stopping these terrorists and going after them and catching them.
Well, and right now, that protects Israel. You've got Saudi Arabia people and Iraq that are a buffer against those people that want to destroy Israel and that want to destroy the United States.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking, let's get some truth out there, man.
Yeah. Well, hey, thanks for calling. I appreciate it. All right, bye. Well, I guess back to this article, David Kay. This is what David Kay said regarding the WMDs going into Syria. This says, David Kay, the former head of the coalition's hunt for Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, yesterday claimed that part of Saddam Hussein's secret weapons program was hidden in Syria. In an exclusive interview with The Telegraph, Dr. Kay, who last week resigned as head of the Iraq Survey Group, said that he had uncovered evidence that unspecified materials had been moved to Syria shortly before last year's war to overthrow Saddam. Quote, "We are not talking about a large stockpile of weapons," end quote, he said. Quote, "But we know from some of the interrogations of former Iraqi officials that a lot of material went to Syria before the war, including some components of Saddam's WMD program. Precisely what went to Syria and what has happened to it is a major issue that needs to be resolved," end quote. Dr. Kay's comments will intensify pressure on President Bashar Assad to clarify the extent of his cooperation with Saddam's regime and details of Syria's WMD program. Mr. Assad has said that Syria was entitled to defend itself by acquiring WMD and a chemical weapons arsenal. Syria was one of Iraq's main allies in the run-up to the war, and hundreds of Iraqi officials, including members of Saddam's family, were given refuge in Damascus after the collapse of the Iraqi dictator's regime. Many of the foreign fighters responsible for conducting terrorist attacks against the coalition are believed to have entered Iraq through Syria. Recently, we almost just went to war with Syria because they were dropping WMDs on their people. Now, there's a big elephant in the room right there, because a lot of people are wondering, where did Syria get their WMDs? It kind of just seemed like their WMD arsenal just came out of nowhere. All of a sudden, oh look, they got WMDs and they're dropping them on their people. Well, where did those WMDs come from? According to David Kay, Saddam sent WMDs to Syria just before the war. There's some other evidence I want to show you guys here, and this is actually a story from the Associated Press. Basically, well, I'll read it. This was posted in 2008. It says, the last major remnant of Saddam Hussein's nuclear program, a huge stockpile of concentrated natural uranium, reached a Canadian port Saturday to complete a secret U.S. operation that included a 2-week airlift from Baghdad and a ship voyage crossing 2 oceans. The removal of 550 metric tons of yellowcake, the seed material for higher grade nuclear enrichment, was a significant step toward closing the books on Saddam's nuclear legacy. It also brought relief to U.S. and Iraqi authorities who had worried the cash would reach insurgents or smugglers crossing to Iran to aid its nuclear ambitions. Everyone is happy to have this safely out of Iraq, said a senior U.S. official who outlined the nearly 3-month operation to the Associated Press. The official spoke on condition of anonymity because of the sensitivity of the subject. The Iraqi government sold the yellowcake to a Canadian uranium producer, Cameco Corp. In a transaction the official described as worth, quote, tens of millions of dollars, end quote. A Cameco spokesman, Lyle Cran, declined to discuss the price, but said the yellowcake will be processed at facilities in Ontario for use in energy-producing reactors. We are pleased that we have taken the yellowcake from a volatile region into a stable area to produce clean electricity, he said. The deal culminated more than a year of intense diplomatic and military initiatives kept hushed in fear of ambushes or attacks once the convoys were underway, first carrying 3,500 barrels by road to Baghdad, then on 37 military flights to the Indian Ocean atoll of Diego Garcia, and finally aboard a U.S. flagship for a 8,500-mile trip to Montreal. And in a symbolic way, the mission linked the current attempts to stabilize Iraq with some of the high-profile claims about Saddam's weapons capabilities in the build-up to the 2003 invasion. See, this was This was an Associated Press story, a major news organization. Now, amazingly, this story was really, it only got coverage on websites of news organizations. ABC News, CBS News, CNN News, Fox News, and NBC News, they all ran this story on their websites. But this story never made it on television, and it never made it on the radio. Why? It's a huge story. We found yellow cake uranium, the seed material to make nuclear weapons, in Iraq. We found that. And I just think that it's a huge story, and I'm amazed that it got hardly any press coverage. We found that material, and they sold it to Canada, and they're now using it for nuclear power. That's an incredible story. And there's actually another aspect of this story that you remember David Kay, and also Dwyer. He was the other guy that was the head of the ISG, the Iraq Survey Group. But he basically talked about what the ISG found regarding Saddam Hussein's nuclear program. And this is what he said. He said, quote, "The ISG also found a previously undeclared program to build a high-speed rail gun," end quote, "a device apparently designed for testing nuclear weapons materials that came in addition to 500 tons of natural uranium stockpiled at Iraq's main declared nuclear site south of Baghdad, which International Atomic Energy Agency spokesman Mark Gwozdecki acknowledged to Insight had been intended for, quote, "a clandestine nuclear weapons program," end quote. In taking apart Iraq's clandestine procurement network, Dwyer said his investigators had discovered that the primary source of illicit financing for this system was oil smuggling conducted through government-to-government protocols negotiated with neighboring countries and from kickback payments made on contracts set up through the UN Oil for Food program. So this is amazing. Iraq, they were building a high-speed rail gun, which is a device that's used for making nuclear weapons and testing nuclear weapons. And, that's amazing. And it mentions in here the 500 tons of natural uranium that they found. See, that's the uranium that they sold to Canada in order to get it out of Iraq so the terrorists and bad guys couldn't get their hands on it. So it's an amazing story that we found basically the stuff you make nuclear weapons and nukes with. We found that in Iraq, and it wasn't a big story at all. It should have been, and it is a big story, and that's why we're talking about it here tonight.